I'm very happy to be here, Rodrigo. I met Rodrigo last year at a conference in Louvain. He was finishing his PhD in this very innovative European doctoral program, and I was his, I guess, guest at their culminating event at the Catholic University in Louvain, and I got to meet Rodrigo there, and when he invited me to come to Torino as part of a trip which will take me to the Netherlands tomorrow at around 3 in the morning. And I just arrived this morning from Washington, D.C. And then on to Germany. I was delighted to accept his invitation and come here and be part of this new college, which in some ways resembles at the master's level what the European doctorate was doing, creating an international cohort of students. And it's interesting that Rodrigo asked me to whether or not I want you to ask questions during the lecture or afterwards. That's a very non-Italian question, by the way. And what I mean by that is at my institute at George Mason, our director is an Italian, a well-known Italian peacemaker called Andrea Bartoli, who played an important role in the Mozambique peace process, for example. But he's also has his PhD from the University of Milano in anthropology. When he first came, he was stunned that American students were raising their hands during his lectures, saying, "Professor, I have a question for you." And apparently that's not done in Italy. People don't ask questions; they listen and smile and say grazie and go on. But this is, again, a very international group. So if I had to choose between sort of the American aggressive style of students demanding their rights, of course, this is apropos of my talk today, or the more traditional conservative style. I would say the American style is probably to be preferred. Having said that, do not raise your hands until after I'm done. Okay, so let me get started. I have a paper. I'm very excited. This is, in a sense, it's the first lecture in this series here at the school. But this is also, in a sense, the first time I've presented this material in public. As Rodrigo said, I've been doing a number of different research projects in Bolivia. In part because I'm interested in Bolivia, and in part because I think that what's going on in Bolivia has lessons for all of us well beyond Latin America, and that there are a lot of important questions which arise from the study of Bolivia. That was not always the case, I might say. It was, for many years in my research, Bolivia was sort of a backwater, as it were, in terms of, there's a Bolivian here, isn't there? Yeah. Yes, okay, yeah. So don't take any offense to this, but in terms of Latin American studies, let's say, it's mostly, foreign Latin American studies. For people studying conflict, violence, and law, it was always Colombia, Peru, and other countries which were more interesting for an international audience. And for the last 10 years, Bolivia has become the most important country, I would argue, in Latin America for different kinds of reasons. And so I've been engaged in this research project, a new research project on the post-2005 Bolivia, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And as I said, I've written a paper, and so I'm going to go ahead and read from this paper, not exclusively, but it's going to be mostly reading, and hopefully you'll understand the argument. And again, it's because this is new material that it's important for me to bring together in a coherent way. So let me begin. So, and one more preface, excuse me. I believe that most of what I'm going to say will have meaning to you, even if you have no idea what's going on in Bolivia, if you've never even heard of Bolivia, if you're like a lot of Americans and can't find Bolivia on a map. I still believe that this will be, that you'll be able to find some meaning here. So let me just begin. So in February 2009, after several years of violence, national and regional political debate, and collective agonizing by center-left intellectuals in Bolivia and beyond, and the emergence of Bolivia itself as a kind of icon of social experimentation in Latin America that falls ambiguously somewhere between Allende's Chile on one side and Chavez's Venezuela on the other, the Bolivian people approved a new constitution in a national referendum that was merely the culmination of a series of popular votes or referenda that have served as socio-political signposts since the unprecedented election of Evo Morales in late 2005. But if these moments of national political and legal strife and performance are signposts, what are they pointing toward? Now, anthropologists and others have grappled with this question over the recent years with a sense of both humility and creativity. In my own recent book, for example, I argue that the first glimpses of the discursive architecture of Bolivia's constitutional revolution revealed a vernacularized form of revolutionary liberalism, one that brought together currents from several distinct legacies of social and political mobilization within a normative framework derived from the rhetorics of human and indigenous rights that took root across much of Latin America in the mid-1990s. And yet the constitutional revolution of Evo Morales and the governing Movimiento al Socialismo, or MAS party, remains elusive or ambiguous for scholars as much as the protagonists and antagonists themselves in what has become a morality play about the potential for and limitations to radical social change in the contemporary world. Since 2005, my research has become part of a wider movement to reassess the conflict in Bolivia and rethink several assumptions that have grounded the critical study of Latin America that emerged in the aftermath of the restoration of civilian governments in the mid-1980s and the rise of neoliberalism in the post-Cold War period. So this talk, as I've already said, represents the first analytical fruits of a study of contemporary Bolivia that has sought to map the landscape of social and political change in a way that also reflects meaningfully on problems of wider significance for us, for example, such as the relationship between law and governance, the consequences and meanings of revolution, the possibilities for post-neoliberal state formation, the tension between governmentality and an ethics of social responsibility, and the ever-present potential for violence in the midst of what is known in Bolivia as refundación, or refoundation. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to first examine the sort of descriptively what this process of refundación means. And then I'm going to go on and explore several discrete but interconnected problems that continue to remain central to our understanding of the meaning and implications of the processes of social change and resistance in Bolivia, particularly since 2005. So what are these enduring problems? First, there's the question of constitutional revolution itself. Just as in the late 18th century in France and North America, and throughout the first part of the 19th century in the Americas, including what is today Bolivia, revolution today still implies a point at a far end of a spectrum of socio-political transformation. Nothing more transformative or radical does or can lie beyond revolution. As anthropologists, sociologists, and others have observed, however, the practice of revolution, as it were, reveals its own cross-cultural contradictions, failures, incompletenesses, hypocrisies, and moments of inspiration. But as a discursive category, as a logic of social and political action, it is important to make the point that revolution implies what can be thought of as a form of secular world reversal, a forced 180-degree turn through the arc of existing relations of power. To this extent, it is analytically awkward to speak of quote-unquote permanent revolution in Bolivia or elsewhere, except to the extent that we can recover the original, largely Trotskyist meaning of a constant international struggle to finally invert all existing economic, political, and social structures. Rather, revolution suggests both a teleology and methodology, even if the moment of secular world reversal, the turn itself, is limited in time, possibly violent, and accompanied by a range of unintended consequences. And yet the concept, if not the practice, of constitutional revolution implies something quite different. since the production, ratification, and implementation of the Constitution do not mark the end of the turn, the reversal. They constitute the revolution itself. In other words, the process of revolution in contemporary Bolivia is manifested in terms of the bureaucracies and instrumentalities of law translated into political and social categories. But is law adequate to the task of revolution? It is one thing to make law the foundation for recovery, or the basic framework for stemming the desire for vengeance and what the Soviets used to describe as liquidation. It is quite another to make law the methodology of radical political and social transformation itself. Now, Bolivia's experiment in revolutionary hybridity follows very self-consciously on the heels of the South African experiment of the mid-1990s. In the first part of my talk, which I'll get to, we'll consider the question of constitutional revolution comparatively. And then after talking about the sort of theory and meaning of constitutional revolution, I'll finish this talk by taking up the question of violence, the different forms of violence within Bolivia's constitutional revolutionary process. Now, post-2005 Bolivia has been rocked by different forms of violence. Some of these you might have heard of, and some of these you probably haven't. There have been there was a massacre of rural union leaders in an Amazonian town. There was supposedly an attempt to assassinate the president in Santa Cruz. Strangely enough, the people who were eventually captured and then killed, shot, were staying in the same room that I stay in when I go to Santa Cruz, which is a little bit ironic. And other forms of violence. During the Constitutional Convention in Sucre, which I'll talk about, 3 anti-MAS or anti-government activists were killed by local riot police. But rather than focus on these much more publicly dramatic moments of disruption and breach, the concern here will be on a more subtle context of violence in this kind of revolutionary Bolivia, what I will call the quote-unquote violence of ambiguity. So what I'm going to argue is that the constitutional revolution in Bolivia is a reflection of, and not a response to, one of the greatest gaps in the early 21st century. This is the gap between the ever-present contradictions of late capitalism and neoliberal consolidation, on the one hand, and the absence of an historically embedded and coherent framework for social and political change that is also an antithetical response to these contradictions. Indeed, as others have rightly argued, the material conditions of life for many, including in Bolivia, have gotten substantially worse during the last 15 years, as the end of the Cold War removed the most obvious discursive counter-argument to the logics of capital accumulation. And in many ways, the dialectical struggles of the Cold War were characterized by the potential for less violence, because the well-defined models for globalization on the one hand and resistance on the other constrained as much as they enabled both argument and action. Clarity in this sense, which was a function of a kind of transnational legitimacy, meant that the parameters of conflict, the boundaries within which struggle must take place, were visible to all. But what happens as now when these parameters, these boundaries vanish? Okay, so let me turn to this, the process of refundación. And to do that, I want to start with some quotes. You know, I'm an anthropologist, and so much of my work is based on the interviews, observations with people who are involved in the process that I'm interested in studying. So let me start with a quote from Carlos Dabdub, who is what I would describe here as the intellectual leader of the autonomy movement and the anti-government opposition based in Santa Cruz, which is a lowland region of Bolivia. And I spent a lot of time with him talking about revolution and law and the government, and what he told me, and suggesting that we have revolutionaries on one side and counter-revolutionaries on the other. He rejected that. Here's what he said. He said, "We are not conservatives. That is, we who oppose the government. We want revolution as well. because the fight for autonomy today is becoming a revolutionary process, and that is our main aim and interest. And the other thing that I would like to differentiate about our true revolution and the false revolution of the government is our method of struggle. For us, the method is democratic. It is through the vote. It is through the respect for the rule of law. The government, by contrast, wants to make revolution without respect for the rule of law and through confrontation, despite the fact that it's a constitutional revolution which is being enacted through law to a large extent. That's Carlos Dabdu. Here's a quote from someone called Sache Llorente, who is one of the key members of the president's inner circle and a good friend of mine who's been in my university several times. He says, this is not his response to Dabdu, but this is his characterization of the Revolution, or the current moment. He says, as a revolutionary government, we are simply a government of the people, of social movements, especially those that are fighting against neoliberalism. Within the revolution, there are various spaces for vigorous debate in which the discussion is horizontal and critical. Many of us never had the intention of holding public office. Yet because it is a revolutionary process, one must assume one's proper role and start building bridges and then burn all the boats after the bridges are built. Because it's a one-way road, for better or for worse, a journey without return. Here's a quote, again, a description of the process of refundación by a kind of low-level member of the movement towards socialism, just someone who's not known nationally, but who I interviewed. He said, "Why do we want to refound our nation? We want to recover our identities and our self-respect. When we speak of revolution as Aymaras, which is an indigenous group in Bolivia, we speak of a democratic and cultural revolution because Aymaras have always been lovers of life, amantes de la vida. For us, the rivers, the trees, our plants, our high mountains are treated like they also have life because they give us food and they sustain us. But this is not an armed struggle. It is a different kind of struggle, as I said, a cultural and democratic revolution in which we don't have to kill anyone because ours is a culture of life and not death." And then finally, a quote about a description, a characterization of this constitutional revolution by the director of La Paz's. La Paz is one of the main cities in Bolivia, and their unions are very powerful. And as you'll see in a minute, the unions are the sort of center of a particular kind of revolution. And this is what Jose Luis Alvarez, who's the director of the La Paz Teachers Union, said about refoundation and about revolution. He said, "Evo Morales, the president, tells us that we are in the midst of a process of peaceful change, that we can't speak of structural revolution, but only a cultural revolution that will lead to a refounded Bolivia. But we, that is we in the Teachers Union, we don't call this a revolution because it doesn't touch the root of the capitalist system, which is private property. How do you know if a revolution is real or not? Based on its position in relation to private property. If it respects private property, it's bourgeois. Now, it might want to change things, make things more humane, fix some things, but if it still respects private property, it can implement only a form of bourgeois change. For us, the only real revolution is one that seeks to eliminate private property and replace it with social property, or something related to the commons, apropos of Rodrigo's course." Okay. Now, the Bolivia of 2010 is a nation marked by a pervasive frame of what I call discursive intensification. As the language, as I've just read from these quotes, people are speaking in this intensified way about the current moment, right? And that's one of the interesting questions. The rhetoric of revolution is in the air. It's on walls, it's in newspapers, it's in government documents and speeches, but most importantly, revolution is an everyday conversation among people across multiple and dynamic political spectrums for whom revolution has simply become another way to talk about the present. But as the quotations from four quite different actors in Bolivia's contemporary drama above illustrate, the meaning and implications of revolution are contested. We have different definitions of revolution. Nevertheless, the multiplicity of both revolution as concept and revolution as practice in Bolivia simply underscores the deeper point. that at least since 2005, the country has been thrust into a period in which all of the historical problems and points of contradiction, which go back to the colonial period, for example, around land, ethnic discrimination, the distribution of political power, inter-regional conflict, and Bolivia's dependence on global capital markets, are now bracketed, framed by a meta-narrative in which the very basis of the nation, the social contract itself, has been put into play. In his excellent recent study of the continuing impact of Bolivia's Trotskyist legacy, the historian Sandor John argues that a culture of radical politics first took shape in Bolivia in the 1930s and paved the way for the 1952 national revolution. The historian John quotes from Guillermo Lora, an early leader of the still active Partido Obrero Revolucionario, or the Revolutionary Workers' Party, who liked to tell his friends that, quote, Bolivia es un país trotskizado. Bolivia is a Trotskyized country. Now, although poor appealed most directly and famously to Bolivia's miners, it also was, and to a certain extent still is, the political movement for certain segments of Bolivia's massive labor unions, such as the teachers, the municipal workers, and medical professionals. And there's no question, as John also argues, that Bolivia's Trotskyist movement is an important source and even organizing principle of what he calls Bolivia's quote-unquote radical tradition. But after 2005, this radical tradition was reinscribed or reinterpreted within what I would argue is a qualitatively different context, one in which revolution is not counterposed with counter-revolution. The left does not exist in a neat and tidy dialectical relationship with the right. Instead, everyone has become, in a sense, an actual or potential revolutionary. And after the ratification of the new constitution in 2009, last year, quote-unquote revolutionary has become a new category of citizenship, even if the ends and content of revolution are, as we've seen, multiple and in dispute. Now, when I asked him if the so-called right in Santa Cruz, in the lowland district, which encompasses a range of political parties and social movements, from the powerful Farm Owners Association to the neo-fascist Falange Party, when I asked him if the right has assumed its historical role as counter-revolutionaries, even Carlos Dabdu, who I've already quoted for, he wrapped himself in the mantle of revolutionary as citizen. He said, again, this is another quote from Dabdu, "We are also revolutionaries. In fact, there are two revolutions in Bolivia now, ours and the government's. The government's is a revolution that seeks to concentrate power. Ours is a revolution that seeks to share power. And when you share power, you deepen, profundiza, the foundation of democracy." And perhaps most revealingly, most surprisingly of all, even Don Juan Carlos Santisteban, who even is not very well known even in Bolivia, but it turns out that he's the kind of spiritual leader of Bolivia's far-right Falange movement, which still has ties to neo-Nazis and skinheads in Spain. In fact, part of my research has uncovered that the Spanish neo-Nazi and skinhead movement has direct connections with parts of the Bolivian Falange, and that they actually have an important role in the anti-government opposition, which is not well known. But even the leader of Bolivia's neo-fascist movement is quick to reframe his movement's ideology in terms of revolutionary struggle. This is what he told me, because I spent time with him. It's interesting. You know how Milosevic, the Serbian right, arguably neo-fascist or right-wing leader, he was also a doctor, medical doctor, that is, not a doctor of philosophy, a medical doctor. This person is also a medical doctor. I'll sort of leave it up to you to speculate about the linkages there. But even he was quick to reframe his movement, that is the Falange, this is about as far right as you can get. He said, quote, "Our revolution is a struggle, only for the well-being of man. This is the only thing we believe in. Our struggle is for man and the well-being of the family, because fundamentally, the family is the nucleus of every society." So clearly he was struggling to articulate his revolutionary philosophy, but he felt compelled even to describe it in revolutionary terms. Now this shift, this discursive shift and intensification in post-2005 Bolivia takes place against the background of what I've already told you is called in the country refundación, refoundation, which is the rhetorical device Evo Morales frequently uses to characterize the constitutional revolution, a manner of framing the process of social and political change that gestures toward the essentially technocratic architecture of a revolution that is being manifested or instantiated through the new constitution and all of the follow-on laws that are meant to elaborate or reglamentar its provisions. Now, this is not an accident of history, this description of revolution as refundación and the manifestation of revolution through a constitution, but was part of an intentional strategy on the part of the movement to socialism government leaders to make the rule of law, and not, for example, old-fashioned revolutionary violence, the framework that would both constitute revolution and at the same time define its outer limits. During the campaign in 2003 and 2004, leading up to the 2005 national elections, Morales was clear that the first step in a new MAS government would be the establishment of a constitutional convention that would produce an entirely new, not reformed, and that's a key difference, an entirely new, not reformed constitution, or as they say, also social contract. In fact, after he was elected with the largest majority in Bolivia since the restoration of civilian governance in the mid-1980s, Morales and a group of MAS advisors and progressive lawyers made a beeline, a direct line for South Africa. In his first trip he stopped in Europe, but he was actually on his way to South Africa, where they consulted with government officials, ANC activists, and human rights and constitutional lawyers over several days of closed meetings. Now, as members of the Bolivian government have explained to me, the purpose of Morales' first trip as head of state was to learn the lessons from South Africa's own constitutional revolution of 1994-1995, which produced what was at the time the most radical post-Westphalian constitution in the world. Now, the main lesson that the Bolivian delegation took from its pilgrimage, because it was kind of a pilgrimage, like going to Mecca, right? It was a sort of, if I can use that phrase, it was a sort of a pilgrimage to the place in which the first post-neoliberal, post-Westphalian constitution was produced in the post-World War period. The main lesson that the Bolivian delegation took from its pilgrimage to South Africa was that the Constitution of South Africa did not go far enough. That was the main lesson. It was, like many constitutions before it, the product of too many compromises, too much caution in the face of demands from the Aung regime. As Heinz Klug has argued in his definitive study of what he calls South Africa's quote-unquote legal revolution, the new constitution of South Africa was torn apart by compromises or agreements to disagree throughout many of its most important articles. And this meant, and now I'm quoting from Klug, postponing decisions on sensitive and potentially unresolvable questions, unquote. The problem, of course, is that many of these sensitive so-called questions were in fact lingering social, economic, and political contradictions that were inseparable from the different versions or iterations of South Africa since the 17th century. So although the enfranchisement of South Africa's non-white majorities and the elimination of the antediluvian system of apartheid represented real and measurable advances, what the 15 years after 1995 have demonstrated more than anything else is that a revolution that is too tightly circumscribed within the logics of quote-unquote democratization is one that is destined to remain incomplete, a kind of ongoing false promise. Now, the leaders of MAS had the case of South Africa firmly in mind as they established the Asamblea Constituyente, or Constitutional Assembly, in the historical capital of Sucre in August of 2006, within the first year of Evo Morales' inauguration. Although the original 255 members of the Assembly represented a broad swath, a broad cross-section of contemporary Bolivian society, politics, and ethnic diversity, It soon became clear to members of the separatist or oppositional eastern and southern lowlands, who were known at the time as the Media Luna, or half moon, because of the way the regions that they represent form a kind of crescent, or moon shape. It was clear to them from very early on that negotiation, real negotiation, over the terms of this new social contract would only be possible within the inner circles of government assembly members and their advocates in the government. Through the end of 2006 and into the first part of 2007, the discontent among the Media Luna representatives in the assembly intersected with another distinct threat of opposition to the government of Evo Morales and his constitutional convention. The local movement, that is the local movement in Sucre, to make Sucre a kind of latter-day city-state that would recover its earlier position of prestige as the site of the so-called first shout of liberty, or the place of the first act of defiance against the Spanish colonial empire in the New World. And I won't explain too much what that means, but it's basically, there's a long history in Sucre that in the early 19th century, the first act of defiance against the Spanish colonial empire took place in Sucre, and that because of that, they should be recognized as the capital and most important city in Bolivia, but they're not. La Paz is. Now this movement, this local movement, which is known as Capitalidad Plena, or simply Capitalidad, which was only on its surface a struggle to make Sucre the plain or only capital of Bolivia, came together with the separatist ambitions of the Media Luna in a combustible mix, a kind of perfect storm of oppositional energy that ultimately exploded outside the walls of the Constitutional Assembly itself. Now, this oppositional energy culminated in a massive demonstration by local townspeople against the Assembly and its members from Moss in November 2007, during which 3 people, including two local university students, were killed by police in the rioting that took place throughout the historic districts of central Sucre. Now, these deaths were quickly invested with the kind of quasi-religious significance that marks all of Sucre's chosen traumas. And in the central plaza, I just went with Rodrigo around the piazzas, right? So in Bolivia, you have the plazas, which are also central areas of great importance. In the Plaza 25 de Mayo, which is the central plaza of Sucre, this has become a kind of religious shrine to the 3 people who were killed in 2007, a shrine to honor their sacrifice for liberty against the government. After the violence of late November 2007, the constitutional process threatened to stall, to end, as the Media Luna and their local Capitalidad allies denounced the Assembly and actually eventually walked out. That is, all of the opposition members walked out of the Constitutional Assembly, leaving a much reduced 165-member delegation that was heavily stacked with government members and their supporters. The Assembly, the Constitutional Assembly, was moved by the national government first to a military school on the outskirts of Sucre as a protective measure, then moved to an entirely new city of Oruro, which was in a solidly pro-government region of the Altiplano, the high part of Bolivia. Now, without any significant opposition presence in the Constitutional Assembly, the process, excuse me, shifted dynamics yet again, and then moved rapidly into a phase that actually encompasses the present, up till 2010. So in December 2007, the Constitution was sent to the National Congress for approval and modification. In October 2008, the National Congress approved the new Constitution and also authorized a national referendum to put the Constitution to a popular vote. In August 2008, a referendum revocatorio, or a vote of no confidence, was held, in which Evo Morales was ratified with more than 67% of the vote nationwide. In January 2009, the referendum on the Constitution was held, and it was approved by 61% of the population. In December 2009, Evo Morales was re-elected with 64% of the vote nationwide, and finally, the new Constitution came into force in February of 2009. Now, during an emotionally charged ceremony in El Alto, which is a city above, kind of a suburb of La Paz, also in the high mountain region of Bolivia. In a ceremony to mark this occasion, that is February 2009, the approval of the new constitution, Morales gave a fiery and somewhat Castro-like speech. If you know, Fidel Castro has the reputation for giving long 3-4 hour speeches in which the Cuban population stands in rapt attention, otherwise they go to prison. But Morales gave a kind of Castro-like speech in which he said, this is his quote, this is in February of 2009, "Now I want to tell you that they can drag me from the palace," that is the presidential palace, called the Palacio Quemado, the bird palace, in part because the presidential palace has been burned over the years, reflecting the legacy of violence in Bolivia. But he said, "Now I want to tell you they can drag me from the palace, they can kill me. But mission accomplished for the refounding of a new united Bolivia." And he also located the process of refundición, excuse me, in a kind of historical sequence of transformation. This is him quoting from the speech. He said, "From the rebellion of our ancestors to the democratic cultural revolution, from the democratic cultural revolution to the refoundation of Bolivia, from the refoundation of Bolivia to the reconciliation between the ancient First Peoples, the originarios milenarios, and the contemporary First Peoples, the originarios contemporáneos." This is what comes next after the refounding of Bolivia. Now, this rhetoric by Morales, who in my opinion has appeared increasingly tired and also defiant in the last 2 years, merely echoed the complex, poetic, and analytically challenging preamble to the Constitution itself, which asserts triumphantly at the end. This is the second to last line of the new Bolivian Constitution in the preamble. It says, quote, "Complying with the mandate of our peoples, with the strength of our Pachamama, Mother Earth, and thanks to God, we refound Bolivia. Refundamos Bolivia." But what does it mean to refound a nation through a constitutional revolution? Okay, so let me talk now about constitutional revolution more theoretically. In one of the most revealing research moments over the last 5 years, I asked the senior Mas senator and former vice presidential candidate Antonio Peredo, during an interview, to explain what we might think of as the normative excess of the new Constitution, the normative excess. 411 articles that contain a version of every international and transnational human, indigenous, and collective right, and many duties that either does or does not exist. I guess they do exist now through the Bolivian Constitution, right? It also contains a new model of the state that radically horizontalizes the relationship between branches of government. At the same time, it creates 3 parallel and juridically independent expressions of the nation: the so-called ordinary, the so-called agro-environmental, and the so-called, and this is the best translation of this, the First Peoples Indigenous Peasant. As some of you know, Bolivia, they've created these impossible categories, right? And the new Constitution creates a new model of political economy that combines nearly every existing economic principle and mode of production, including communism, market capitalism, state socialism, small-scale social cooperativism, unionism, syndicalismo, and sustainable development. All of these are brought together in the new Constitution. Now, after giving my sense of the scope and implications of the Constitution, after explaining to Peredo what I think of as the normative excess of the new Constitution, I asked him to explain it. I said, "How do you explain this Constitution? How do you explain the normative excess? What were you trying to do with this?" And he looked at me, and again, this is a moment which I'll never forget, and which I'll probably spend the rest of my career trying to figure out. And his explanation was, "We just couldn't say no." Now, what he meant, and what this says about the possibilities for and impossibilities of radical social change in the contemporary world, the 21st century status of power in post-colonial countries, and the absence of a well-defined non-liberal models of state formation, among others, is the basis for my book, which is the longer work that this talk, in a sense, synthesizes. But for my purposes, for this talk, what is most important about Torino's acknowledgement, we just couldn't say no, is what it tells us about the character of law as both the locus and means of revolution, as both the site and the means of revolution. Now, there was no doubt among the MAS assembly members, especially after the opposition had abandoned the constitutional process from within, that the new Magna Carta, which is also how they refer to the constitution in Bolivia, it's the social contract, it's the vehicle for reformación, it's the Magna Carta. There was no doubt among these members of the opposition after they had abandoned. There was no doubt among the MAS assembly members after the opposition had left the process that this new constitution would limit as much as it would enable the process of refundación. That is, the constitution would both bracket institutionally and comprise the revolution itself. To this extent, it was important among the MAS delegates, some of whom were acting as clear proxies of the government, of the president, vice president, and leading intellectuals and advisors in the government, to ensure that the new social contract was as normatively centrifugal as possible, like a centrifuge. Ideas, concepts, nascent models of government that had any support at all, at least by some delegates, and which did not crudely represent a vestige of one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which in Bolivia are colonialism, imperialism, racism, and neoliberalism. As long as the proposal didn't represent a vestige of one of those four things, these were put into the new constitution. Any idea, good or not, plausible or not, which was not an obvious legacy of colonialism, racism, etc., was given the initial legal grounding from which it could develop or not, as the case may be. And yet a legal grounding for an idea, especially a revolutionary idea, even one that is intended to expand and then frame the possibilities for radical and social and political change, is not just any grounding. It is not just an alternative mechanism of revolution. It is not simply the framing of transformation in other terms. Rather, what we might call the quote-unquote legalization of revolution produces what Gunsel and Schmidt-Neuer, in his afterword to Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment, calls quote-unquote a change in function. The legalization of revolution produces a change in function. That is, a shift in both the meaning of and possibilities for revolution because of its quote-unquote failure to be realized in existing society. And here I'm referring to the dialectic of enlightenment. Except in the case of the Bolivian Constitution, the change in function does not come as a response to the failure of revolution, but as a way to prevent that failure in the first place. In other words, the absence of a viable, non-liberal, and thus non-constitutional model for radical social and political transformation means that constitutionalism in Bolivia represents a kind of Hobson's choice. Constitutional revolution, with all of its contradictions and structural limitations, or nothing. But even if constitutionalism was the only viable option available to MAS political activists and intellectuals as they envisioned a post-neoliberal Bolivia, this comes back to my question, is law itself adequate to the task? This is an important question. What are the implications for the Bolivian Revolution of what the Chilean legal scholar Javier Cusó has recently described as the quote-unquote judicialization of politics in Latin America? Okay, these are the implications, as far as I can see, of the legalization of revolution. First, there is the problem of a fundamental tension between the form and the intent of law in revolutionary Bolivia. A kind of what we might think of as normative irony, in which the centralizing and exclusionary forms of law work against the intention to use the new constitution to pulled the existing nation-state apart at its economic, political, and cultural scenes. Now, the Constitution, in a sense, recognizes this tension and attempts to lessen it by displacing, pushing aside both the locus and legitimacy of justice from the institutions of law to the people. So the Constitution recognizes that the law has this effect and tries to deal with it by saying, well, wait a second, the locus of power, the locus of legitimacy is actually not in the Constitution itself, it's in the people. It tries to deal with this. And so this is what Article 178 of the Constitution says. It says, quote, the power, potestad, which is actually more than power, but we can translate this as power. It's a Spanish legal concept. The power to impart justice comes from the Bolivian people. And this power of the people is characterized by independence, impartiality, transparency, swiftness, legal pluralism, interculturalism, equity, service to society, citizen participation, social harmony, and respect for human rights. There it is. You see that normative excess? It's right there. They couldn't say no. Any concept that was current in the sort of transnational activist world is in most sentences of the Bolivian Constitution. The Constitution also develops an alternative to the dominant liberal legal principle of secular jurisdictional autonomy, in which the law of the nation-state is sovereign within a differentiated hierarchy of regional and subject matter competencies. Now, Articles 179 to 192 of the Constitution establish three entirely separate legal systems in revolutionary Bolivia. There's not one legal system in revolutionary Bolivia, there are three separate legal systems. The first is the so-called ordinary court system, with its own hierarchy of courts, culminating in a court of last resort called the Supreme Judicial Tribunal. The second legal system is the agro-environmental legal system, with its own courts, headed by a court of last resort called the Agro-Environmental Tribunal. And finally, there is an indigenous peasant legal system, comprised not of courts in the strict sense, but the quote-unquote mechanisms of indigenous justice, which are found throughout the country. And I should say, very importantly, these same articles say nothing about the process of appeal within the indigenous peasant legal system. So there's no Supreme Court, as it were, of the indigenous peasant system. There's the constitutional court, but there's not this sort of court of last resort as there are in the two, there's a good reason for that, because the sort of, as I studied in the north end of Potosí, the mechanisms of sort of indigenous justice don't culminate in an appellate system. Now, Article 179 says that the ordinary and indigenous peasant legal systems are equal, and one does not have clear supremacy over the other. The status of the agro-environmental legal system in relation to the other two is not elaborated. So basically, it's a mess. And yet all of this innovation takes place not simply within the boundaries of the Constitution, right? At first, those 411 articles, but even more in terms of a massive body of what is known as the Derecho Reglamentado, the hundreds of follow-on laws and administrative orders that must be promulgated in order to actualize the articles of the Constitution within the chaos of Bolivian society and politics. And to a large extent, this massive body of law remains today, and will remain for some time, simply a figment of the Mas's revolutionary imagination. Not because of a unified opposition to the Constitution necessarily, but because the machinery that must produce the Derecho Reglamentado grinds forward with the kind of bureaucratic inertia that characterizes the production of follow-on law all around the world within forms of governance of a wide range. In other words, the process by which the principles of the Constitution become actual laws follow the same kind of bureaucratic machinery we see all around the world. Another important lesson for constitutional revolutions. So a constitutional revolution in this sense does not suffer from a gap between an idealistic theory of radical social change and the mundane and compromising realities of implementation. Rather, the problem is that the mundane realities of implementation are actually derived from the framework through which the theory is expressed, that is constitutionalism. In other words, the problem in Bolivia is not that we have theory on one hand, this idealistic revolutionary theory, and then the practice of law. The problem is that the theory is part and parcel with the Constitution itself. That is the theory of radical social change. It's coextensive with constitutionalism. Now, a second implication of the legalization of revolution in Bolivia is that the logic of law, including constitutional law, depends on a particular kind of rationality through which social, political, and ideological problems are broken down into their smallest coherent parts and then addressed as if those problems were microcosms of the whole. That's the procedure, that's the logic of law. But justice has led to what she calls fictions of justice. That is a gap between the complicated aspirations of diverse actors within local contexts and histories and the tendency of international law to reduce moments of atrocity and victimization to their juridical essence. This gap is the basis for giving meaning to international justice beyond law. That is, she actually thinks that there's a positive implication to this process. But we can also see how this technocratic reductionism of law can make it irrelevant, or even worse, as a mechanism for transforming the underlying contradictions that give rise to demands for radical social and political change in the first place. And finally, the legalization of revolution in Bolivia has implications for what we might call the phenomenology of social change, which is the elusive, the ambiguous, and often contradictory experiential dimensions of people's lives in the midst of social transformation. So, for example, for Alejandro, a social work student at the National University in La Paz and a leader of his faculty student union, the new constitution is a means through which the Bolivian state will become, in his words, quote, more open, more accessible, and more connected to the people, unquote. Alejandro also sees the Constitution as a symbol of a new orientation to the relationship between nature and society, which was his own interest. As he puts it, quote, the Constitution takes inspiration from the way of life in the countryside, where the huipala, which is the indigenous flag, is a symbol for how to live in nature, as part of nature, and to return to nature after you die, unquote. For Patricia Choque, who's the General Secretary of Bolivia's Confederation of Women Peasants, she at least was, several years ago, perhaps the most powerful woman within the indigenous movement in Bolivia. For her, the new constitution is most radical in the way that it recognizes and gives force to what she calls, quote-unquote, community justice, which she believes is the essence and greatest asset of indigenous culture, which she believes is the foundation for modern, or should be the foundation for modern Bolivia. And for René Gonzalo Parra Gallardo, who works in an entity called the Defensoría del Pueblo, which is a kind of a national human rights office. For him, the simple existence of a new constitution is a way to silence critics of the revolutionary process, especially those in the media, the national press, who, quote, allow themselves to become puppets of those in the more conservative sectors of society who want to destabilize the government and avoid as long as possible the inevitable process of change. Now, what these and many other reports which I can give you from the ethnography of revolution in Bolivia tell us is that the government's strategy since the early 2000s to make the new constitution the embodiment of revolution has had a profound impact on the ways in which people think about and talk about conflict and the possibilities for social transformation. But when the Constitution is the embodiment of revolution, what lies beyond? In other words, what does it mean when the chronically deferred hopes of historically marginalized populations, as diverse as they are in Bolivia as elsewhere, become encapsulated within the four corners of a legal instrument? As I have already argued, a revolutionary constitution is like a promise. But what is the likelihood, even the inevitability, that this promise is destined to be seen as false? Here is how Heinz Klug characterized the same problem that confronted the South African constitutional revolutionaries in the mid-1990s. Quote, "The struggle against apartheid was premised on the promise of a future South Africa in which all people would enjoy rights and opportunities. Despite these high aspirations, the builders of a new South Africa faced a formidable legacy of inequality, social dislocation, and destitution. This was the context in which the ANC thought about the responsibility of governance, and this is how it framed its constitutional options," unquote. But as Klug himself and other scholars of post-apartheid South Africa have demonstrated, there has been an enduring gap between rights and opportunities in South Africa, both because the quote-unquote formidable legacy of inequality, social dislocation, and destitution continues, albeit in different forms and in relation to different sets of actors, and because the framework of even a radical expansion in constitutional rights and categories can only begin to adequately address the range of structural problems that this quote-unquote formidable legacy represents. That is to say, what Klug means by opportunities are not a necessary consequence of what he means by rights. And when the most pressing structural problem within this formidable legacy is the kind of inequality in landholding that one typically associates with feudal forms of land tenure, then the enfranchisement of a new majority and the reinscription of the citizen in terms of human rights can quickly appear as hollow victories indeed. Now, the legacies of inequality, social dislocation, and destitution in Bolivia have been no less formidable than South Africa's, even if Bolivia's poor and marginalized have been formal participants in the nation's political life since the 1952 National Revolution, which ended the dreaded literacy requirement at the polls and established de facto universal suffrage. In practice, de jure, at least in theory, universal suffrage. In practice, however, Bolivia remained through the end of the 20th century, in the historian Herb Klein's words, quote, "a typical racist state in which the Indian non-Spanish-speaking peasantry was held in control by a small white Spanish-speaking elite, and in which political power was ultimately based on violence rather than consensus," unquote. Now, that's, of course, an extreme characterization of power inequalities of Bolivia, but there's some truth in it. Now, the new Constitution proposes a radical break from this history, from top to bottom. For example, by imposing a so-called social usefulness test on all forms of private property, by shielding rural, social, political, and legal institutions from the control and oversight of the state, and by creating a 5,000 hectare limit on land ownership. So now, in the new Constitution, 5,000 hectares is the limit, the maximum limit on land ownership. But how will these constitutional mechanisms of refundation respond when the problems they are meant to address continue, or even deepen in the coming years? That is, what is going to be the reaction of the people when those problems are not overcome? It would seem that something more than a revolution embodied and thus circumscribed by a new constitution is necessary. Something more than a new constitution is necessary. As the great American abolitionist Frederick Douglass said, quote, "Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters," unquote. And yet, doesn't this great truth, born of another formidable legacy of inequality, suggest the possibility, even the desirability, of a process of refoundation that takes place well outside the boundaries of law? Through forms of targeted violence, perhaps? So, this is where I would take up the question of violence. But I'm looking at my time, and My suggestion, Rodrigo, would be that I stop here and sort of pick this up as a class discussion. Rodrigo, is that okay?
It's okay.
I was going to say, I would now talk a little bit about violence, but I would say now that my suggestion would be that we open it up for questions, and if the issue of violence comes up. But I think I've given enough for us to talk about in terms of refoundation, and especially in terms of the relationship between law and radical social change, that perhaps this would be a good time to stop. So thank you very much.